Hello and welcome to another episode of the Pro-Life Hour. My name is Joe Chevary and I'm the seminarian intern for the summer of 2021. So as you can tell, this is not your typical Pro-Life Hour. Father Tom and Father John, your typical hosts, are very busy with their parishes. And so for this month's episode, I decided to come in myself and let you listen to the Humanae Vitae conference talk by Father Tom that was given in 2008. I find it stellar. But before we get into that, there's a few things I want to let you know. Firstly, this podcast is now available wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, Stitcher. All of those platforms host our podcast now. So please make sure to follow us on all those so that you don't miss another episode of the Pro-Life Hour. Next, we need funding for myself. The seminary internship program requires about $10,000 per summer. So, to fund myself and for future seminarians to come in and learn about Priests for Life Canada and spread the word about Priests for Life Canada, that requires money to hire a seminarian for the summer. So if you feel so inclined, please donate to Priests for Life Canada and make sure you specify that it is for the seminarian internship program. Also, a little bit more about Priests for Life. We host three things. We have clergy e-notes, which provide Sunday homily help for your pastors, your priests. We also provide a bi-monthly newsletter with informative information about pro-life topics in Canada. And lastly, we have this podcast, and usually Father Tom and Father John will be interviewing medical experts and people in the pro-life field. So without further ado, I want to give you the Humanae Vitae 2008 conference talk by Father Tom. There's a few things you should be looking out for when you're listening to this. First, I find it really important to listen to Father Tom and how reasonable Father Tom is. Father Tom speaks with truth in this and gets to the heart and the problems of why the Catholic sexual morality seems so irrelevant nowadays. But he also gives tips on how to prove that it is the right morality and proving that it is the correct morality for sexual ethics. And I think you're going to really, really enjoy it as much as I did. This was one of the first things I listened to on my internship, and it is absolutely fascinating. Now, Father Tom said he gave the talk on a little bit of a whim, but man, did he craft it so perfectly. So without further ado, here is the conference.
For those of you who are familiar with our organization, you know that our first national director, Father Jim Whalen, passed away suddenly while doing a pro-life mission in Thorold earlier this year. And we were sitting in the church in Ottawa immediately after his funeral mass, a few of us from the board sitting around and wondering, well, what do we do now? And we all kind of look at each other and, will you take it on? I don't think so, I can't. How about you? Well, no, I'm kind of busy. And will you take it on? No, I don't really feel cut out for it. And so we did this time what we did the first time. We kind of put a wish list together to give to God to say, well, who we might like to take this over. And guess whose name was at the top of our wish list? No. Father Tom Lynch. This was after I'd said I'm not going to do it. So, no, it was Father Tom Lynch, because we know that he probably is one of, if not the best qualified priests in this country to lead this organization at this time. And so we put him on the top of our wish list, our prayer list, and guess what? God said yes. More importantly, his bishop said yes. And he said yes. And so we're very blessed to have him now heading up our organization and being with us here this afternoon to round out the speakers. And I'll just quickly run through his bio here, because it's almost as long as the talk he's going to give. Father Tom was born in Lindsay, Ontario on July the 29th, 1957, and ordained to the Catholic priesthood in the Diocese of Peterborough, Ontario on May the 25th, 1984. His extensive knowledge and experience has made him a popular advocate, lecturer, and teacher in the area of family life. Some of his involvements include member, Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops, project on bioethics and its effect on the family in the 1980s, ethics consultant, Archdiocese of Toronto, Ontario Catholic Conference of Bishops, Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops, chaplain, Toronto Catholic Doctors Guild, advisor, Thomas More Lawyers Guild of Toronto, member, Ethics Committee, St. Joseph's Hospital in Peterborough, Ontario, lecturer in moral theology, and extensive involvement with St. Augustine's Seminary as professor of moral theology, where he taught bioethics, sexuality, and marriage, and papal teaching on social justice, which I believe he still does to this day. At St. Paul's University in Ottawa, he taught sexual issues and Catholic morality, bioethics, and introduction to moral theology. Father Tom's experience in media work is also well known. In addition to approximately 150 interviews, Father Tom acted as media spokesperson for the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops, the Ontario Catholic Conference of Bishops, the Archdiocese of Toronto, the Diocese of Peterborough, and St. Augustine's Seminary. His professional associations include the Canadian Bioethics Society, the Federation of Seminary Spiritual Directors, and the Canadian Catholic Bioethics Institute. In his position as National Director of Priests for Life Canada, Father Tom, when coming on the board, took immediate action to fill vacancies that existed on the board and nominated a number of young priests whom he had helped train in the seminary, convinced them to join the organization. In addition to his role as National Director of Priests for Life Canada, Father Tom continues to serve as pastor of St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Douro, Ontario. Father Tom plans to use his extensive knowledge and resources within the Catholic community to advance the purpose and aims not only of Priests for Life Canada, but of the entire Canadian pro-life movement. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Father Tom Lynch.
So people say, how long have you been interested in this whole question of Humanae Vitae? Well, I was as a kid very prone to avarice. I had a godmother who every year on my birthday used to send me $5 every year. And living out in the country without a chance to have a lot of jobs, I was always waiting for that $5, you know. So up came late July 1968, and I was haunting the mailbox. And sure enough, on July 26th, the day or so before my birthday, I went out there, no check, you know, but the Toronto Star was there. And the headlines in the Star were, Pope bans the pill. So I was coming in reading this, and I came into Mom, and I said, Mom, what's the pill? She said, I'll tell you later. But she never has. 40 years. You know, there are some anniversaries, these ruby anniversaries, which are happy and it's wonderful. And then others just say, for heaven's sake, why can't you just get over it? 40 years, you know, don't you realize that like any of those other documents, it's old, it's gone, it's buried. It's not for nothing that the title of this whole time together today was A Buried Treasure. But the reality is that some things are even better. Perhaps the more that we are able to discover and indeed rediscover them. Is it just the case that this is a document that came out at a very, very confused time? Or is this kind of a teaching which can resonate throughout time and resonate throughout the ages? And I would posit that it is. In terms of relevance, it's always relevant. An unnamed bishop, he's dead now, so he knows better, said one time, the battle for Humanae Vitae is over. That's why I say he knows better now. And I said, no, it's not over, because you're confusing something very definite. The reality is that the battle for your soul is never over until death. And the battle for the soul of a family is never over until death. The battle of the soul, for the soul of the church, the battle for the soul of all the human race is not over. It's a continual work. It's a continual battle. And each and every time someone comes to be able to say that they truly love that other person, then they must deal with the issues that we've looked at today. And I think that there are 10 things that I would like to be able to bring up as to the relevance of Humanae Vitae in our time, in our day, and in our lives. I always think it's a good thing, you know, to have a mnemonic, an easy way to remember something so you can count through on your fingers. The first is conscience. Because it is a very, very basic fact that the teaching on human life caused a major rift within the Catholic Church. That's the reality. Even now, amongst moral theologians, amongst whom I tend to spend some time, that is the watershed. You're this side or you're the other side. And the way of looking at the whole question of conscience is even now incredibly confused. Why is it confused? Because we all struggle, as a Catholic, I say we all struggle with the idea of original sin. I want what I want when I want it. Isn't that the case? I don't know if you remember the cartoons, Calvin and Hobbes. Great cartoon. Too bad it's over. But in Calvin and Hobbes, the little guy, Hobbes, who's about 7, comes to his mom one day and says, "Mom, you know that book you got me from the library?" And she said, "Yes, Calvin, I do." And he said, "I read it. It was remarkable. It was it blew my mind. It changed the way I look at the world." She says, "Wow, that's great, Calvin." And he said, "No, it isn't. I don't want to read another one." Don't bother me. Don't wake me up from my self-induced slumber and stupor. And that is the difficulty we have. I want to be able to make up my mind so long as I don't have to exert too much energy into it. And one of the hard things is to be able to say, you must think. And you must be able to recognize that you are called to learn. And you're called not to be able to just assume that you have all the answers. And in this, one of the core problems of our time, of course, is that people don't think, they feel. And people will actually equate the words think and feel. Isn't that the case? How many times have I given pro-life presentations, primarily on abortion, and at the end of it, people will say, "Well, that's what you think, but I feel this." Okay, so feel trumps think. But it doesn't do that in conscience. In conscience, we are called to be able to remember that God has given us this great instrument and we must use it. Like it or not, we're going to be using it. And we're constantly tasked with saying to people, how are you forming your conscience? What are you putting in? Is it only garbage in and garbage out? Or are you willing of human living and Christian community? And he said the same thing is true in our day, that we too are seeing the end of one culture. The culture that ended in the middle of the 20th century, and we thought we were holding it on. You want to call it the fact that we live in a postmodern culture? Perhaps that's true. But the reality is that between them and us, there's one big difference. There, the barbarians were at the gates. For us, they've been ruling us for quite some time. And we are waiting, MacIntyre said, doubtless not for another Trotsky or another Godot, but for a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. I remember sitting at CTV in the TV studios when the announcer basically came out onto the balcony and announced, we have a pope, and his name is, and he's chosen Benedict. And I just came to mind because consciously he took that name. He took that name from Saint Benedict, who was the founder of monasticism, and we often think one of the saviors of Western civilization, but also from Pope Benedict, who during and at the end of the First World War fought valiantly to be able to truly have a Christian culture. And that's what we do. We are called not to take it for granted anymore. We're not taking it for granted. You must consciously build a culture. And to build a culture is complex. But building a culture doesn't happen from the top. It isn't a question just of your museums. Culture is built from the bottom, like any good edifice. It is built with a strong foundation. It is built by making conscious, hard choices, and it is built by linking together like-minded people so that we form first networks, then communities, and then that civilization of life and love. That's how it is built up. And we ourselves are called to be able to do that, and we're called to be able to recognize some hard facts. Every time I see statistics about Catholics, I say, what a bunch of junk. Because the real statistics for Catholics are the ones that practice their faith and the ones that are just baptized. Okay? The ones that practice their faith, we're an odd bunch. We really are. We stand out. We're an awful lot closer to the evangelicals than to almost anybody else. I don't know if you know that or not, but it's true. And it's strange things that have happened in our time. I can remember being involved in Operation Rescue a number of years ago and being thrown in jail with evangelicals. And, we teach them to say the rosary and they teach us how to sing. And who would have ever thought that evangelicals and so-called, quote, Orthodox Catholics would ever get along? But we found out that in this mystery of God's plan, we have an awful lot in common. An awful lot in common. And we have a lot in common with other people. A few years ago, I was at the University of Toronto in Mississauga, and myself and a Muslim professor We're debating the Raelians. I don't know if you remember the Raelians. The Raelian, Rael, is a French-Canadian guy who decided that he was basically like sort of an incarnation of a type of gods, and the gods came from other planets, and he had a whole new religion. And they said that they cloned a human being. Do you remember this a number of years ago? Anyway, so his bishop was there, Bridget, and him. And so anyway, I turned to this Muslim professor from the University of Western Ontario, and I said, Ali, tonight it's the believers against the non-believers. He said, you're on. And that's true. That within this culture, within this conscious culture, we are called to be able to form whole different bonds. And I believe that because this buried treasure that we celebrate today speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human, that is something that we have as a language between individuals, one to another. It is not some kind of treasure that we hold only to ourselves, but it's a treasure, as it says in another place in Scripture, that is like pressed down in your lap and flowing over. That's what it means to be able to have a conscious culture. Thirdly, I believe that we need to be able to recognize that Humanae Vitae is relevant because we need to be able to recapture sexuality as wonder. We need to be able to say that sexuality is not something which is just plumbing. That's not the way it works. Sexuality is wonder because, in effect, we can never be able to dissect sexuality. In a way, we can only know the geography of sexuality. And in geography, you only touch, in some ways, on the surface. It takes a great deal of work to be able to recognize that we hold on to that wonder of what it means to be able to share in the life of another person, and to be able to share in the life of another person in such a total way that that trust that I desperately want, that I desperately seek, can be found and reciprocated. And that it can be found in such a way that I don't have to wonder, if I'm using up my time on the parking ticket. It doesn't have to be wondered and shared. It's just a matter that we share it with ourselves so totally and completely that I believe that it's something that will actually fulfill me. And fulfill me in such a way that it won't mean that we end up as carnivorous beasts devouring each other, but instead that out of that love will come another whole life or lives. That's a phenomenal thing. And it means that instead of us just being able to say, well, this is how things work, we need to be able to say that there's something deeper here, something that by which we can be able to respond to that deep mystery which is at the core of each and every person. And I believe I am a mystery to other people. Hey? Heaven knows they say it often enough. But the reality of the situation is that we are. And we want to be able to be appreciated for that because each and every day, it isn't as if I become a new and better person, but each and every day I can be discovered because I share in that little bit of eternity. Because that's eternity, eh? Eternity is that eternal eureka moment when all of a sudden you're discovered again and again in ways that we can't possibly imagine. How many couples who've been able to delve into each other's lives through the joy and the wonder of their sexuality have become far, far more than they could ever imagine that they could possibly be. Fourthly, I really believe that we have to be able to accept our roles, if you want to be able to know and to follow this teaching, as sexual subversives. You don't often think of yourself as sexual subversives, but you are. You're subverting the dominant culture because the dominant culture says you are mechanistic. All you are is a thing. All you are is an object. And you can be used and you can use. The dominant culture says just fit in to whatever nice and neat little boxes to be able to be categorized. But a sexual subversive says that's not the reality of life at all. And if you think of yourself as a sexual subversive, then I think you can be able to say, there is a new and definite way, but it's entirely countercultural to what is being forced at us. And people love that. Especially young people love that because it's part of growing up to want to be countercultural, isn't it? It really is. To be able to reject whatever is before us and to be able to find it on our own. And this is what I believe that we can have. This is the new teaching. This is a teaching ever ancient, ever new. And it means that for ourselves, it's not accepted by the culture, and therefore, it's going to be something that people want. Young people want to be those sexual subversives. And I believe that in that, we have to be able to be really clear about something, and that is the power of ideas. Don't knock an idea. If you look to see how our culture has become the way it isn't just a matter of diabolical actions. It's also a question that ideas that have been percolating through the thoughts, the minds, the writings, the schools, the very way that we structure our society have been percolating through it till all of a sudden people say, well, there it is. How do we end up with this culture the way it is? That is the power of ideas. And we too have to be able to hold fast to that power of ideas to be able to say there is something new and very different here. Fifthly, I believe that this mad drive towards environmentalism can be used to our own ends. Because I believe that, as Dr. Craw spoke about and spoke so eloquently, we need to be able to look at this as a human ecology. When I stand up and speak to young people about this, I say, isn't there something wrong that we take perfectly healthy women and we say you've got to be drugged and plugged and clipped and snipped? And they sort of look at you. I say, do you really hate yourself so much that you think of something that is so central to your being, your own fertility, as a horrible burden? Do you really want to be with a guy that says, I love you except for the fact that your fertility is a real drag? Is this what you really, really want? Quite a number of years ago, when I was going around in high schools and helping with some of the natural family planning, we were struck by when we talked to our teenage girls and we actually spent time with them and taught them the method, in this case, the Billings method. A very strange thing happened. Within about 60 days, about 75% of those who were sexually active stopped being sexually active. And you know why? Because come Friday night, the boyfriend would say, well, we've got 2 hours until mom and dad get home, and so therefore, let's go. And the girl would say, yes, but I'm fertile for the next couple of days. He said, no problem, dear, I've got the condom. And all of a sudden, even the dimmest girl, even the girl most enthralled would say, wait a second here, something's wrong. And that's what we have on our side. I really do believe that we have this idea of a human ecology to say, why would you, who is so against dumping any kind of chemicals into our external environment, think that it's a good idea to dump it into our internal environment? Is this really a bright thing to do? And sexual environmentalism is something that perhaps you haven't heard in terms of two terms being put together, but it's a lot to be said for the sense of the human ecology, to be able to be said, what is truth? And that brings me to my sixth point. We're very confused about science and technology, aren't we? Very, very confused about science and technology. We all use technology, right? Glasses, watch, everything else, most of what we're wearing, all of this. We like to use it, but we don't really trust a lot of technology. And increasingly, people of our time are saying, what is technology actually doing to us? And this idea of being able to look at something such as the pill or other types of contraception as technology sets off a sort of a deep type of warning bell within us. Now science is a different matter. We've dropped the infallibility of the Pope and we have the infallibility of science. And the only reason we have the infallibility of science is because we have such short memories. Okay? Don't eat things that are high in cholesterol. Eat things that are high in cholesterol. Don't eat eggs. Eat eggs. Don't, back and forth. We're not too sure about science, but we believe in it, right? But the reality is the reality. And we can be able, I think, to use science. It's not for nothing that the late Pope John Paul the Great said that we need to be able to truly have faith and reason, and never to be afraid of faith and reason. Because there are many things that tie people down, that enchain and enslave people. And it is only the truth that will really set us free. And if you don't think there's sexual slavery, I would say to you as a priest who has heard many, many confessions, talk to the majority of young men and not so young men and realize the sexual slavery that has come about because of the sheer epidemic of easily accessible pornography. That's slavery. If you want to be able to see what is before us, recognize that the slavery that's there because of fear, because of the sense that, well, I must do this or else I'll lose him, I'll lose her. I have to do this because how can I be able to trust in this person? There's an unfortunate reality, and that is that the majority of the people in our society are sexually promiscuous without even knowing they're sexually promiscuous. The reality is that most of the people being married in our churches have lived together with at least one, most three people. They have not necessarily, quote, cohabitated in terms of taking up the same residences, but they basically have. That's more or less the average. This is not good for the future of their marriages, and we think we could know that. But we have to be able to say, well, if that is the case, then what do we do about it? And people are shocked, absolutely shocked when you start to talk about it, because they say, gee, how can I be able to do this if you suddenly want me to change my life? And I say, don't be afraid, you've nothing to lose but your chains. It's not often I quote Marx, but it's true. There's nothing to lose but your chains. But it's a hard thing to lose chains, eh? When the Israelites were out in the desert and life looked tough, They didn't trust in God. This promised land, it was going to be forever, 40 years in the desert. We know about 40 years in the desert, right? But, what did they want to do? They wanted to go back to Egypt. And you know what they said they missed in Egypt? You know what they missed? Melons and onions. They wanted to go back to slavery for melons and onions. Think about it. Think about it. What do we want to go back for? And we all want to go back because from a distance it looks good. So we have to be able to remember that in what we're doing, we are fighting not just against the powers of light and of our own day, but we are truly fighting against the powers of darkness. And it means that we have to be able to start to work with people to be able to know the person before we just know what it is we are saying. And that means that we have to critically examine the nature of authority. Here, I'm going to say something that bishops don't like to hear. But the reality of the situation is that in the late 60s and early 70s, bishops got very, very confused. Know the person before we just know what it is we are saying. And that means that we have to critically examine the nature of authority. Here, I'm going to say something that bishops don't like to hear. But the reality of the situation is that in the late 60s and early 70s, bishops got very, very confused. Now, we only draw bishops and priests from the pool of people that are in our time and our society. But most bishops didn't have a clue about what went wrong because they assumed, because they were formed for years and years in a Catholic family. Do remember that when I went to the seminary in 1980, you had to have your parents' marriage certificate. Okay? I remember my parents they weren't too sure about me back and forth. I come from a very big family, and I'm the sixth boy. I'm a lower middle of about 13 kids. And Mom was sort of busy. She had all these kids, and she taught. And I needed their marriage certificate. And so I came home one Friday night from university, and she was pretty harried. And I said, Mom, I need to talk to you for a second. Okay, no problem. So we came in, and I said, Mom, I need your wedding certificate so I can get a copy. No problem. It's all here in the buffet. All the papers are in the buffet, right? So she went in, was flipping through. She said, what do you need our wedding certificate for? And I said, well, I'm going to the seminary, and I have to prove I'm legitimate. She said, you're a seventh natural child. Of course you're legitimate. And then she turned right back, and she started looking for the paper again. And she said, you're going where? But for the reality of most people, that is not just the commonly accepted reality anymore. But it was then. Janet Smith, who wrote about this whole question of Humanae Vitae, its reception, etc., now 10 plus years ago, said we were not ready, okay? We were not ready for the cultural tsunami that hit us in many, many, many ways. We thought what we had was strong. Little did we realize that God has no grandchildren. It's true, eh? God only has children. God does not have grandchildren. It's, you want to build your house on a solid foundation. It doesn't matter how solid your parents' foundation is. You got to build your house on a solid foundation. That's the reality. Each and every generation must be won over to Christ. And the bishops were not ready. And they blew it on power and authority. They blew it. They confused power with authority and authority with power. And they had not trained their people at that time well enough, and frankly are not training them well enough now. They're working hard, but it's always hard to come from a rear guard position. So that's what we need to do. And you need to be able to look at Humanae Vitae and recognize that it wasn't just for the bishops. In fact, most of these encyclicals written on sexual matters and on social justice matters are written to all people of goodwill, to you and to you, according to your specific jobs and roles. And with the collapse of authority in the 20th century, because it looked as if all fonts of authority had blown it badly, then what authority is there? Authority will come about, as John Paul II has said many times, through teachers, through those who are examples of faith, through those who will be able to live their faith regardless. Martyrs are always martyrs. Martyrion just means witness. And the power of witness is incredible. It really is. And you can be a pretty strange witness and still be a witness, see? When I was a pastor in a little place up in Peterborough, I'm back in another little place in Peterborough, I was really pushing the whole idea of natural family planning. Man, I pushed it. We had 300 families, 90 baptisms a year. I mean, I was pushing natural family planning. And I got a teaching couple to come in, and I had invited everybody. We'd phoned, we'd mailed, I'd preached on it for a couple weeks. One couple showed up. One couple. And I got to tell you, and I have their permission to say it, they weren't the most promising couple. The Lord hadn't blessed them with good looks, didn't have a lot of higher education. They were a rough pair. They really were. In between running the goat farm and doing the construction backhoe, they were a rough bunch. And I was sort of down, and the teaching couple, John and Sheila Harrington, said, Father, this is just the couple the Lord wanted here, because they need the one-on-one. So 4 weeks in a row, they met at my rectory, and we went through the whole thing. And it was amazing, because our Lord took that couple, and they were the couple that evangelized the entire parish, because they'd stand outside and they'd say, this natural family planning stuff is great. Eric would say, I've never had so much good sex in my whole life. It's great. It's great. It's great. And the guys would all stand around going, oh, really? And Pauline would say, this is really neat. He was such a pain before, but now, he's good to get along with. And they were pretty graphic, too. I'll spare you the details. And people looked around, they said, wow, if this has made an impression on them, what could it do for me, for us? We're far better material. But that's the reality. The reality is that I believe we have to be able to look at that. They were people of authority. And I would posit to you, you are people of authority. You are people of authority, but authority is nothing if it is not used. There is nothing worse than seeing parents that will not exercise their God-given authority. There is nothing worse than a teacher who will not teach. Sad, eh? And when you get to heaven, as we hope to, the Lord's going to say, what did you do with the people that I sent to you and gave to you? Well, I didn't want to upset them. Or I didn't love them enough to get to know them so that I could be able to teach them. It is more important. If you want to teach Latin to Johnny, it's more important to know Johnny than Latin, right? Because I will listen to someone who loves me, but I'm not going to listen to somebody who doesn't love me. And you know why that's so hard? It takes a lot of time. Love takes time, right? I can't do it on the stopwatch. And if I want to be able to really be that person in authority, I must love before I speak. To make a friend and be a friend before we bring a friend to Christ in whatever form that teaching is going to be able to take place. That, then, I think, is that nature of authority. It's one thing. You can't just bewail the fact that something went wrong in the past. We don't live in the past. The past is gone. Only our Lord is the Lord of history. My past, it's there. I only have now, and I have the future. And therefore, what we have to do is to be able to call people to this. As Father Paul said, as the head of the Priests for Life Canada, one thing I constantly have to try to do is to be able to encourage priests. I have to encourage priests. Speak up. Who cares if people are going to say they might be angry, somebody will say. I said, yeah, they might. That's true. They might do this. They might write a letter to the bishop. God forbid that you get a letter to the bishop, or worse, a phone call. But the reality is, do you love them enough to want to be with them? Do you love them enough? And are you willing to be loved enough? And I would say this is part of your job, is to be able to love someone into the fullness of being, to be able to love them into the fullness of the teaching of the truth and not just the truth. Because we have to love people into authority and be able to say, you can do it. And if you don't believe me, think about St. Catherine of Siena, the most unlikely person to have been able to restore the papacy to Rome. Who did she think she was? This rather strange, perhaps, somewhat anorexic character who had visions and who didn't have any education, and she was just this young whippersnapper, and she travels all the way to Avignon, and she does something nobody had been able to do, even with the force of armies, to be able somehow to convince this pope to come back to Rome, and thereby to be able to restore his authority. And I would say, you're unlikely to. You are, but that does not make you less of a person of authority. We are where we are for a reason. Every single one of us are where we are for a reason. And if you look at how people have been restored, God can use even you, and he can use even me, to be able to build people up in courage. Have courage. Okay? Be able to have a heart that is so full. That's where courage comes from. Have a heart that is so full that it must be able to speak. And I tried, the prophet said, not to speak, but it built up with me, and I spoke. And that's all it takes. I think, too, we need to be able to look critically and recognize that we need to talk about what it means to be human. One of the hardest problems we have in our society is we're really messed up about what it means to be human. Not just about fetal development, as incredibly important as that is, but what does it mean to be a human? Did you ever stop and look at On Human Life and Humanae Vitae and say, this idea of human love, like it's got to be human, it's got to be total and faithful and exclusive and open life. What do you mean it's got to be human? That's because what is our tendency? To use somebody as an object, right? You know, I remember I achieved something in life, and I got a card from a friend of mine, and he said, "Congratulations on your success." And I opened the card. How many people did you have to step on to get there? Ooh, how well did he know me? But that's the truth, eh? And philosophers, all kinds of secular philosophers, have seen that. To use a person as an object, eh? As an end, as a means to an end rather than an end. There's the things that we have to look at. But it's not just that. There is the increasing complexity of what it means to be human in our time. Certainly, as I alluded to earlier, in the area of sexuality, certainly. What's one of the big problems that women have had within marriage? Because their husbands are so exposed to all kinds of perverse acts that husbands have seen in pornography, they want to be able to incorporate this within their sexual acts of marriage, and they don't like it. They don't want to be treated as whatever. There was a scene in an otherwise rather forgettable movie by Paul Simon called California Suite, where there is a couple and the husband is bisexual. He obviously has all kinds of affairs. The wife has had her one chance to win an Academy Award, and she hasn't got it. It's pretty down. They retire back to their suite, and they're going to be engaging in sex, and he closes his eyes, and she says, "No, open your eyes. Tonight, let it be me." Interesting, isn't it? That's the power of thought. And we need to be able to recognize that that is something that we need to be able to say it is possible to know what it is to be human. Not just fighting against all the new technologies, the so-called confluence technologies of nanotechnologies and artificial cognition and the new genetics. Not just talking about the whole idea of robotics or whatever, but what it really means to be human, to be engaged in the human enterprise. As Cale said, you know, it is a type of time bomb, I believe, this whole theology of the body. It's a tough one, the theology of the body. You know why? Because it's not easy plowing through John Paul II's thought. But like any plowing, and as a guy who comes from a farm, like any plowing, it's worth the effort, because you have to be able to turn it over and turn it over to be able to come gradually to see what it means to be fully human. What does it mean to be able to be a gift? That's really an incredible thing, and it's something most people don't think about, you know. We don't think about what St. Paul said, "You are God's work of art." You ever think about that? You look in the mirror and you say, I don't know. Race a few lines, you know. It's like that woman who was so upbeat all the time. Man, she was upbeat. And they asked her, said, "Mabel, how come you're so optimistic? How come you're so upbeat all the time?" She said, "Well, every day I get up and I look in the mirror and I say, 'Mabel, you look fabulous.' And then I put in my teeth." But we are God's work of art. But if I look at myself, I hate to say it, but you know, I don't know. You look at this side, you look at that side, and there it is. But we need another person to say, "But you are God's work of art. You really are a person who is truly loved because you're human in the fullness of what it means to be human." And that's an astonishing thing. It's hard to talk to people about what it means to be human. Hard to talk about what it means to be able to aim for in science and the rest of it. But one beautiful phrase has come up, and that is the flourishing of the human person. Isn't it? The flourishing of the human person. It takes into account that whole idea that we truly are brought to fruition, brought to flower by the fact that we are loved. I had a lot of brothers and sisters, 8 natural and 2 adopted and 21 foster children. And it was really interesting, even as a child, to see bruised and broken and wounded children come to our home. And it wasn't easy. I'm not going to say it was peaches and cream. It wasn't easy. But you know, there's only one thing that restores a person to being fully human, and that's love. It's a tough love. It's a hard love. It's a love that, you know, I had 5 teenage sisters at the same time. Nobody had to tell me about menstrual cycles or anything else, man. Premenstrual tension, I couldn't have told you what it was, but I knew what it was. That's all there was to it. My mother used to say for years she was a hormonal hostage. But the reality of the situation is that there's only one way to restore a person to being human. You know, you can have all your definitions all you want. And the 60s and the 70s were rife with definitions, but they were all wrong. It isn't levels of this and stages of that. It's all or nothing. It's the fullness of being. And that's what we need to be able to say. It is possible for you to be human. It's possible, and I will prove it, because in this most intimate of our decisions, I will follow through with that decision. That's what it means to be human. I think as well, too, we need to be able to recognize that for some people, they don't want to talk about the intimate aspects of their life. If we are talking about Paul VI as a prophet, then I believe that my second last point is this, that he was able to show that we are going to throw out all the natural ability of the human race to be able to continue. We are witnessing a demographic collapse. It didn't just happen. It's been the result of a great deal of work, to convince people that having a child is a burden, that having a child is something horrible, and other people of other skin colors having children is even worse. That's the reality of it. And the way to fix all problems is to be able to just cap the so-called population rise, and we're seeing that problem right now. One reason why Chrysler's having troubles, because you can't sell that many Windstars to people that are retiring. That's the reality of it. And we're seeing that right across the board. This idea of a demographic collapse is something that people are finally waking up to, but they don't want to see it in their own lives because they're threatened. I come from a little village, really. It's a hamlet. It's not even a village. We have 142 children in the school. And I had a meeting there last spring. We had a meeting, and they were really concerned. 150 is the magic number for the Peterborough Catholic School Board. Below 150, you start to lose services and have multiple grades in the same classroom, and they were very worried. And they were upset. 50, 60 people were there. That's a lot for us, okay? And so somebody said, well, Father, what do you think? So I stood up and I said, well, you can move school boundary lines. That might work. You can try to get more Protestants in, but we got them all. I said, you can try to get a few people to have their kids in private Catholic schools, but I doubt that because they're paying a lot to do it. I don't think you're going to change it. And I said, but here's the big thing is you don't really care because you only have 1.85 children each. I checked. I said, and that some of you have 6 and 7 children, few. So that's most of you, though, only have 1.85 children. Your personal decision is having a public policy effect, which is having a personal effect. So it's your fault. And they sort of went like this. And somebody said, well, I expected a priest to say that. I said, I'm a priest that can count. I said, here's the fact. Go home and ask yourselves why you're afraid of having children. I'm not talking about your financial situation. I'm not talking about the hassles in your marriage or anything else. Face fear, and then you might find that the fear is not as great as you think. And we need to be able to ask that. The demographic collapse is not something on charts. It is something that has happened because of fear. And the Lord does not mean for us to dwell in fear. He doesn't. So I believe that we can actually be able to say to people, well, this is what it means. You can say whatever you want, but this is what it means. Lastly, I believe that it's not enough for us to just come and have a nice day together with like-minded people. Like shall speak unto like in the roar of the waters, as it says in scriptures. And there's been a lot of roaring around in the years. And isn't it nice to be with people that agree, people that are pushing for the same thing, and that we applaud at the right time. And as Dr. Cross said, we put up our hands at the right time once we're well-educated and the rest of it. But that's not enough. The reality of the situation is that when the people were baptized in the River Jordan and they came up out of the River Jordan and they spoke to John the Baptist, the question that came was, what then must we do? What then must we do? How shall we live? And I believe that we are called, when we are building up a civilization, a culture, to recognize that it is not just personal decisions. It's the question of being able to say, what do we want as a culture? What do we want as a civilization? Hypothetically, if a priest, let's say, who was a director of the Priests for Life, was asked to speak to a bunch of bishops, just hypothetically, and, you brought up questions, and somebody brought up a question to me, and I said, well, here's my question to you. What do you want? What do you really, really want? To quote those great philosophers, the Spice Girls. What do you really, really want? Okay. Well, there's something to be said for it. And I would posit to you, do you have 20 legislative things that you want? Because the bishops haven't so far. Now, hopefully they'll be challenged to that. What 20 legislative things do you want? Because when I talk to members of provincial parliaments and legislatures and members of federal parliament, they say, but you're so sort of chaotic about what you want. You want one big thing. Tell us what we can do legislatively. What does it mean to be able to have a society where women are actually supported in having children? What does it mean where we can be able to actually think about, once again, having a living wage for people so that a father can actually have a wage and be able to support a family on one wage? Think about that without having to just, get all your basic bargains at Value Village. I mean, the reality of the situation is, what does it mean when we talk about matters about credits for children when we desperately need children? What does it mean for us to be able to say, how do we encourage people to get and to stay married legislatively? What does it mean when we talk about people who, when they opt out of the workforce, are paying for it with their pensions? Why do we have a third of our elderly women, right? We need to be able to be clear about this and say, if we want a civilization, then any civilization, every future, as John Paul II said in Familiaris Consortio, every future comes by way of the family. And we need to be able to have that. A truly pro-family set of legislative proposals to stop and say, what do I need? What would make my life better so that I could be able to have a fuller life, so I could encourage people and others could be encouraged so that they can be able to have the support of what makes us fully social beings, our society. And that's not impossible because the Lord brings everything around, you know. He brings around the possibilities that we are able to look to say, what does it mean that we can be able to have a whole society that truly supports families and not just is going to be social engineering. When I was sent off to study moral theology, my brother Danny said, well, that's going to be an easy thing to teach. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you just walk into a class and write no on the board and that's it. Okay, you're Catholics, aren't you? You know? No, that's not true. I believe that yes, every yes is also a no. But we have to be people who will say yes to life. To be able to say yes arising from our fears, yes arising from our limitations, a yes to be able to say that we can be able to build this culture. It's said that when the Israelites came back from Babylon, they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem with a sword in one hand and a trowel in another. And we have that sword of truth and righteousness. And we have a trowel to be able to build up those bricks, which are the very living stones who are the souls of the people gathered here and the people to whom we are sent, so that we can build up this civilization on a strong foundation to be able to bring it to the world, to be able to say this too can be a city shining on the hilltop, a city whose truth and whose life will not and cannot be hidden. This is what we have. A treasure that once buried, when unburied, will draw people to itself as surely as people are drawn to truth, to goodness, to light, to the jewels which we hold and that which we are given for others. Thank you.
I'll take it up. So, Father, are you open for some questions? Okay. I'll walk around with the wireless that we had, and we'll...
This is the worst time for a speaker waiting for questions. Anyway. I've said this before, but I know I speak very quickly, and so that's an understatement. I was giving a lecture one time, and one of the students, he was racing along trying to keep up with me. I said, okay, now we'll have a break. And he put down his pencil and went, oh. Yes?
Father, thank you for such a great presentation, and I've got more of a comment, I think, than actually a question. I agree with you that conferences like this are a great start, but I also think that if we really want to get the message across, we have to start changing the way we look at our marriage prep courses, because I remember
they suck. They're not marriage prep courses. I couldn't agree more. I hate to interrupt, but let's be honest. They're not marriage preparation courses. You cannot take people from our society. It's not their fault they're in our society, because we're all where we are. But that you cannot effect a change in people by one single weekend, short of a sheer act of God. Father Joe Hattie, who should be known to many of you, and I think is one of the pioneers in this, Father Joe Hattie was very clear when he talked about marriage and family formation. And here's one of the problems. You get your child baptized, and then nobody misses you again. You don't show up at Mass again, and nobody ever misses you. So you're obviously not too important for the community. You get married, and nobody misses you again. You see? So what does that say about you, that nobody even misses me? Isn't that something? That's sad, eh? And so nobody cares enough to even come visiting. Even they don't care enough to go for the sheep that's lost in the wilderness. And why do we believe in the Bo Peep syndrome? Leave them alone and they'll come home wagging their tails behind them. That's not true. It's not true. It's just not. So, come to grips with the fact that you must take over the commanding heights of education within the church. One of the major things is you must take over marriage preparation and completely reform it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think in my situation, they probably spent probably 10% of the marriage prep on sex, and out of that 10%, probably 2 or 3% was on natural family planning. So there was almost no attention to natural family planning, and everything else was on. We kind of suggest that you don't use natural form or.
Yeah. So I would agree. I mean, I just think that it's been brought up a number of times, and I couldn't agree more that as an area of basic education, and at a time, believe it or not, when people are relatively open, they want the best. They know shacking up is shacking up. You build a shack and not a home, and it's okay for a summer on the beach, but when the winter wind blows, it's not much, And I can go down the line too. Trial marriages, who wants to be on trial, right? And who's the judge, jury, and executioner? It's pack your bags, the party's over. And I can go down the list of why shacking up and everything is wrong. It makes for a very interesting sermon. I'll tell you, boy, people shape up and listen. But people want the best. They really do. They don't want a disaster in their marriage. Of course they don't. Come on, they're not masochists. So I think it really is a time that we can look at. But you got to throw out the old way. That's so 60s. It just hasn't worked. So get over it.
Hi, Father Tom. Being an academic, I know you won't mind a quotation. This comes from an article in the October 2008 Homiletic and Pastoral Review entitled Humanae Vitae at 40. The desire not to seem out of step with current attitudes has brought silence from parents. The desire not to lose popularity has brought silence from pulpits. So with the possible exception of the parish of St. Joseph in Douro, Ontario, why are we not hearing, I can't hear a priest preach a homily on sexual morality or natural family
Well, I think
planning
there's some very definite
or
reasons.
in our high schools.
Okay. Your teachers in high schools are only from the same pool as everybody else. Okay, so from pulpits, I think there's a couple reasons. One, a lot of times, I think priests feel, they're so uncomfortable talking about sex that rarely, for instance, will priests really talk about when couples come in to talk to them and they're shacked up, as the majority are. They'll rarely talk about sexual matters with them. And the priests have not generally invested enough time in finding a cadre of teachers within their parish and then training those teachers and, frankly, investing in the teachers. You get what you pays for. See, I'm a big believer you got to pay for stuff. You can't just take people that are good intentioned. You have to be able to put money, real money, into having teachers in your parish. So I think that, they need to be brave about it. And they also need to recognize that the few people I know that have preached on it haven't preached, first of all, Catholic priests don't have enough training in preaching. And we're too harried to prepare our homilies very well, so it's pretty thin sometimes. But at least that's the excuse. But the other part of it is that they tend not to be able to plan out their teaching. So I bet you don't know what you're going to get for a homily, not tonight, but next week in your parish, right? That's not very good teaching. Teaching, you should know that now we're going to take this and this and this and this. So you should plan it. I say to people, plan your year and go point by point by point by point. I think if a priest stands up and says you shouldn't contracept and because of this and this, of course people are going to go, what the heck was that all about? Where did that come from? Because next week we're going to talk about love in one of the epistles of St. Paul. And the week after that we're going to talk about the greed of Bay Street. So I think the good teaching means that it's good planning. But I do think that the generation of John Paul II is changing things. And the priests of the generation of John Paul II are starting to change things as well. So I think there's good possibilities there. But I would really say to you, you have an obligation to sit down with your priests and say, Father, we're not getting a lot from sermons, and you work hard. Because they do work hard, believe it or not. They sweat buckets over preaching. But now, how could we help you in this regard to help with teaching? How does it work for teaching in this regard? And I think that's where I believe we have to be able to do this as one of the central matters of our time. I couldn't agree more. You have to speak up, I think.
Father Lynch, sexual subversiveness. Now there's a news bite and a sound bite.
Yes, I know.
That could be used actually, to elicit a lot of excitement and a lot of people making the decisions, as you were saying, and committing to this fantastic program, which I didn't know that much about, to be honest with you. And I feel passionate now about joining in. And in fact, I wanted to ask you if there, this is a buried treasure, so we haven't yet developed this program, have we? Humanae Vitae.
Well, I think it isn't just a program. I think that it is actually part of a cultural reality. How could we say that the people that have worked so diligently for so very long in the natural family planning groups and associations haven't worked desperately hard at centers and associations and everything else? And I am not denigrating anybody who has been courageous in trying to teach this in the schools and in homes, classrooms, parishes, at all. I do believe, however, that it's time that and well past time, that we coordinate our efforts. And one thing about the church is that the church is a past master at actually tying together these disparate movements of the Spirit to be able to see, well, what is the Spirit saying to the churches, as it says in the book of Revelation? And the Spirit is really saying to the churches that we must be able to speak the truth in these areas of life, of love, of sexuality, of marriage, of family. And so he raised up John Paul II, and he's raising up other prophets in our own time, I believe. So that's what I believe we need to do, is to take what is happening, the good that is happening, and to be able to encourage it further, and to be able to pay for it, and to encourage others to be able to lend their voices to what will necessarily be a broad array of choices that will be before us. Maybe you're not the person to speak to 15-year-old boys about the whole concept of sexuality and the difficulties facing young men. God knows it's hard to be a young man in our society. Hard to be a young woman too, And yet we need to be able to do that according to the gifts that we have. And that's why I think you call forth those gifts to be able to speak in season and out of season. So that's what I would say. Yes, I believe so. Yes. You should always know your outcomes. Always should be able to measure outcomes. Yes, you can. You got to be able to say, was it worthwhile? Yeah.
Father, this is a pastoral question, I suppose. Are a Catholic couple who have opted for contraceptive sterilization, tubal ligation, or vasectomy, are they?
A Catholic couple that has opted for sterilization, yes? Okay, Brian, I'll repeat it.
The question is, in the call to repentance in this area, are they required to consider a reversal?
Well, okay, so a Catholic couple that has opted for sterilization, surgical sterilization, in the nature of true penitence, are they required to at least investigate the possibility of a reversal? Actually, that's a question that's come up very often, and most moral theologians, and I would agree, would say no, because any surgical intervention is necessarily fraught with some difficulties or dangers. And you can be able to say, well, this is done, and what's done may not be able to be undone, but in the nature of penitence, it's a question about being able to say, regardless of this, however, one could still repent for the act. It's exactly the same principle as trying to have restorative justice. In the end, you can't really restore justice. Justice is the Lord's. But I think that with the nature of penitence, it's interesting that I have known couples that have, by the nature of repenting and being willing to talk about why they mistakenly chose sterilization, have prevented others from taking that step. Because it's something to say to people, don't do as I do, or else a large number of our parents could no longer speak about sexual morality because they were sexually immoral before they were married. And are they just to shut up and say nothing? Or to say, I was stupid, there's no reason for you to be stupid too. Should I tell you a quick story? My mother is from the parish where I am. I'm related to 75% of the people in the parish. I am. And my brothers, I have 3 brothers and sisters that married into the parish, and 2 older women were talking to each other the second Sunday that I was there, and they were talking rather loudly, as is their wont. And one said, "Have you known Father Tom for long?" "Oh, I've known him forever. I knew his mother, and we grew up together." And "Yes, but have you known him for long?" "Oh, I've known him forever. I've known him since he was stupid." So it should hopefully not negate the fact that you can say something intelligent afterwards. So I think the same thing is true with penitence, because we hear that in Humanae Vitae when the Holy Father spoke to those women who'd had abortions and said, "But you can be a strong voice for life. Here too, these people can be a strong voice to be able to say this." And we grew up together, and "Yes, but have you known him for long?" "Oh, I've known him forever. I've known him since he was stupid." So it should hopefully not negate the fact that you can say something intelligent afterwards. So I think the same thing is true with penitence, because we hear that in Humanae Vitae when the Holy Father spoke to those women who'd had abortions and said, "But you can be a strong voice for life. Here too, these people can be a strong voice to be able to say this is what you can be. You don't have to follow this path."
Just a qualification on that. Medical hazards. It's my understanding that in this day and age, if you had one of these procedures lately in the last few years, is a big difference, say, than 20 years ago or whatever, in terms of the medical.
Well, it depends entirely on the individual who's done the procedures, and it has its own difficulties, especially with things such as clipping or cutting fallopian tubes with scarring, etc. So I would doubt that would be without its hazards.
Okay.
I think the next is, and that would be our last.
Yes, Father, thank you. I'm on the faculty at McMaster in the Department of Family Medicine. My question to you is, here in Ontario this past summer, a lot of us doctors who don't contracept and don't refer for abortion were put on notice that we're going to be hauled up in front of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Mm-hmm. And so there is a war coming. And what I'd like to know from you is, perhaps it is time for Domine Quo Vadis. Maybe it's time to return and be crucified. But is there any word of wisdom that you can give those of us who've been in the trenches about how to avoid crucifixion if we can be smarter, or is that inevitable?
Wisdom and knowledge is not wisdom. Okay, you can have all kinds of people that are smart but really act stupidly because they've never reflected on their knowledge. And prudence is the practical exercise of wisdom. Because we are social animals, we must, as the Greek philosophers say, be political animals. Because we must negotiate constantly. Anybody that's had a 2-year-old knows that. You must negotiate constantly. And indeed, if you're married, you know that. I've got a bishop, I know that. Okay? Okay. And it means, politically speaking, that there are all kinds of levels of politics. It's called subsidiarity. And those levels are necessary for a fully functioning civic society. So we necessarily will meet with those who are professional in whatever degree. Okay? And therefore, I would say to people that one of the works that you have to be able to look at is exactly what Pope Leo XIII and every other pontiff since has said, that this is a union, okay? Within unions, there is a moral responsibility, whether you call it a union or professional association, there is a moral responsibility to take the roles of leadership, which is politics, within that professional association or that union. So that's number one. I really believe that as grubby as it is, as you think it is, politics is a noble thing. We cannot live in society without politics, not just at the MP's level, but basic politics at these associations, whether that is teachers' unions, school boards, professional associations. And you have to absolutely be militant of saying, I refuse to pretend that this is a secular society. We do not live in a secular society. We live in a pluralistic society. And if you don't believe me, look at a $20 bill and see who's on the $20 bill. The head of the Anglican Church is on the $20 bill. So this is what I call political jujitsu. You must demand, you have to use their weight against them in jujitsu. Eh? I know because I'm small. So you use their weight against them. Okay, and the same thing is saying, do you understand that if you try to force this on us, that I will go to the Human Rights Commission? Okay, that I will go there because when when I stand up before university groups, I say, hi, talk about a triple loser here. Male, okay, Catholic, and a Catholic priest. And yet I'm here not because I'm a Catholic priest. I'm here because I'm a citizen, and I have a right to speak. And you are not going to take that right away from me. Because we live in a society where I have fought for this right, and others have fought for my right, and the same thing is true here. So you're quite right. I believe that we have to engage in that battle as well. But let me say one thing. You need to be able to recognize that we must be, sharp in this battle and recognize to be willing to be engaged in the battle. But we also must recognize that at times we will have to suffer the fate of martyrs. Very interesting that John Paul II in almost all his documents talked about martyrdom. And he meant martyrdom. And we will all have to suffer that to some degree. But don't be a stupid martyr. Eh? I asked my parents when I was 10, why was I named Thomas? And my mom sort of stopped and said, I'm not sure. We were sort of busy. Oh. But she said it means you can get to choose whichever patron saint you want. That's good, eh? She was sharp on the uptake. And she said, so I chose St. Thomas More. Because he was a smart martyr. In some ways, he was a reluctant martyr. Okay? But he did everything to do that he could do, and I believe that is what we're called to do too. It may be martyrdom. You're quite right. It may be, Quo Vadis is where Peter turned again to come back to Rome. Eh? But not before its time. Because remember that it's not just myself that might have to suffer that, but I have to be able to defend others who will not be as brave, who will not be as skilled, who will not be as connected or whatever. That is my responsibility too. We must be able to be drawn together. Alex just said, there is strength in unity, and that's what we aim for. And Dan's coming up. So thank you very much.